Dhamma, it stated something beautiful. It said that listening to the Dhamma helps you to develop your Dhamma knowledge. What it says? Listening to the Dhamma helps you to develop your Dhamma knowledge, your knowledge in the Dhamma. And then it said that developing one's Dhamma knowledge helps one to develop one's wisdom. So if you have a good knowledge in the Dhamma, then that knowledge helps you to develop your wisdom. And when you investigate the Dhamma you have learned with that wisdom, it stated that it results in your well-being. It results in happiness, not only in this life, but also in your next life. Meritorious disciples, if you think about the ordinary society, we learn a lot of things. From the moment we are able to understand something, we learn things. We learn how to walk, we learn how to talk in our childhood. And as we grow up, we go to school and we learn different subjects. We learn things, we learn different subjects. We gain knowledge to get a good career, to get a good place in society. We learn how to cook, we learn how to drive. In this way, we learn a lot of things throughout our whole life. But if you really think about it, the fact is that the things we learn in this life comes to an end at one point. And what is that point? With death, our knowledge, the things we have learned, comes to an end. That's reality. But meritorious disciples, if you learned the Supreme Buddha's amazing teaching, the Dhamma, then that knowledge, that Dhamma knowledge you gain, is not just for this life. It comes with you in your next life and brings you happiness. It helps you to find real happiness, true happiness. It helps you to escape from suffering and attain Nibbana. Meritorious disciples, today we are going to learn a beautiful sutta that explains about how our knowledge in the Dhamma, how our Dhamma practice helps us to attain Nibbana. And the sutta explains how it helps us to escape from suffering. This sutta was taught by our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha. And the name of this sutta is known as Sotanudata Sutta. It's found in the Anguttara Nikaya of the Pali Canon. In this sutta, we can really see the amazing qualities of our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha. This sutta emphasizes about our Supreme Buddha's Lokavidu quality. Lokavidu, as you know, refers to the fact that our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, understood all worlds. The Supreme Buddha understood the human world, the Brahma world, the heavenly world, and the hell world. Not only that, in this sutta, we can see that our teacher, our great teacher, is Sattādeva Manussanam, is not just a teacher to human beings. Our great teacher's Dhamma helped even gods to find real happiness. So today, let's learn the Sotanudata Sutta found in the Anguttara Nikaya of the Pali Canon. Meritorious disciples, the Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, when one has followed the teaching by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them well by weave, 4 benefits are to be expected. What did the Supreme Buddha say? The Supreme Buddha said, O bhikkhus, when a person listens to the Dhamma, he retains the Dhamma, he remembers the Dhamma, and then he recites the Dhamma, recites verbally, and then he examines the Dhamma he learned with the mind. And when he does so, he gets a good understanding, a clear understanding of the Dhamma. When a person does these things, the Supreme Buddha explains, that person can gain 4 benefits. 4 benefits are to be expected. So meritorious disciples, before we continue in this sutta, take a good look we must take a good look at the factors the Supreme Buddha explains in this. Here the Supreme Buddha is explaining the factors a person needs to become well versed in the Dhamma. The first is you must listen to the Dhamma. What's the first factor? You must listen to the Dhamma. Now in Pali it's known as Sutta. Sutta means you must first listen to the Dhamma. Meritorious disciples, you may think listening to the Dhamma sounds very simple. But listening to the Dhamma is not something very simple. When you listen to the Dhamma, there is a certain way that you must listen. The Supreme Buddha explains, Atikatta. Atikatta means you must pay your full attention when you're listening to the Dhamma. Manasikatta. Manasikatta means you must direct your mind towards what you're listening. Atikatta, manasikatta, sabba chetaso samanaharita. That means you must direct your whole mind, your complete mind, towards what you're listening to. And then the Supreme Buddha explains, sabba chetaso samanaharita, ohita soto dhamma sadati. You must listen to the Dhamma with your ears well directed at the Dhamma. So you must listen with your full attention, with your whole mind directed towards the Dhamma. And you must listen with your ears directed towards the Dhamma. This is how you must listen to the Dhamma. Meritorious disciples, one day a deva, a god named Chandana, came to visit a bhikkhu, and he asked a bhikkhu about a certain gatha, a certain verse that the Supreme Buddha had taught. And at that time, that bhikkhu told that deva named Chandana that he was not able to remember that verse. Now that bhikkhu went to the Supreme Buddha and told the Supreme Buddha what happened. So that bhikkhu said, "Oh Venerable Sir, this certain deva named Chandana came and asked me about this verse, but I wasn't able to recall it. And so I asked that deva Chandana whether he was able to remember. And of course that deva said that he was able to remember. And he told me the verse that he learned from you in the deva world, in the heavenly world." Now at that time, meritorious disciples, our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, told that bhikkhu that deva Chandana listens to the Dhamma with these factors. Atikatta, he listens with his full attention. Manasikatta, with his mind directed towards the Dhamma. Sabba chetaso samanaharitva, he directs his whole mind, complete mind, towards the Dhamma when he's listening. And he directs his ears towards the Dhamma when he's listening. That's why the Supreme Buddha explained, that's why, O bhikkhu, that Deva was able to remember the verses that I taught him. So meritorious disciples, you can see, listening to the Dhamma means you must listen with your whole attention directed, your whole mind directed towards the Dhamma. And then the second factor here is you must first listen and then you must retain the Dhamma you learned. So you must first listen and then you must try to remember what you learned. That's the second factor that you must have. Now the Supreme Buddha has explained there are different types of people in this world. The Supreme Buddha explains there is one person who is like an inverted pot in this world. There's another person who has lamp-like wisdom in this world. And there's another person, the third person, is like an upright pot. Now the Supreme Buddha uses this simile to explain how different people listens to the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains, there are some people in this world who goes to the monastery to listen to the Dhamma. So they go with the goal of listening to the Dhamma. So of course, the monks in the monastery teach us the amazing Dhamma that's pure in the beginning, pure in the middle, pure in the end. So when the bhikkhus teach the Dhamma, this person does not pay attention to the Dhamma. He does not pay attention to the beginning, the middle, or the end. So while he's sitting down, he doesn't pay any attention to the Dhamma. And he leaves the monastery and still he doesn't pay any attention to the beginning, the middle, or the end of the Dhamma that he learned. The Supreme Buddha explains that person is like an inverted pot. No matter how much water is running from the tap, that pot isn't able to collect the water. The water runs off. Why? Because the pot is turned upside down. The Supreme Buddha explains the first person is like this. No matter how much he listens to the Dhamma, if he doesn't pay attention to its beginning, middle and end while he's sitting down, and if he doesn't pay any attention to the Dhamma when he leaves the monastery, then that person isn't able to retain the Dhamma. He's like an inverted pot. And then the Supreme Buddha explains the second type of person has lap-like wisdom. That means he goes to the monastery wishing to listen to the Dhamma. He goes, he sits, and the bhikkhus teach the Dhamma. So while he's sitting down, he pays attention to the beginning, the middle, and the end of the Dhamma talk. But the moment he leaves the monastery, he doesn't remember anything he learned. He doesn't pay any attention. He doesn't try to remember what he learned. He doesn't pay attention to what he learned after he leaves the monastery. The Supreme Buddha explains he is like a person who has lap-like wisdom. The Supreme Buddha explains, suppose a person is sitting down and he has all sorts of food items on his lap. There's candies, there's jujubes, there's different types of food items in his lap. And for as long as he's sitting down, those food items will be in his lap. But the moment he gets up, what happens? All those food items fall on the ground. The Supreme Buddha explains the second type of person is like this. For as long as he sits down, he pays attention to the beginning, the middle, and the end. But the moment he leaves the monastery, he doesn't pay any attention to what he learned. And as a result, he forgets the Dhamma he learned. And then the Supreme Buddha explains the third type of person in this world. The Supreme Buddha explains the third type of person is like an upright pot. He goes to the monastery hoping to listen to the Dhamma, wishing to listen to the Dhamma. He goes to the monastery, he sits down, and when the bhikkhus teach the Dhamma, he pays good attention to the beginning, middle and end. And he doesn't just pay attention while he's sitting down. Even after getting up and leaving the monastery, he tries to remember what he learned. He pays attention to the beginning, the middle and end of the Dhamma talk. And as a result, he is able to remember the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains, only the third person, only the person who's like the upright pot. Now, if you put an upright pot under a tap, the water gets collected inside the pot. Why? Yes, because the pot is upright. The water is able to go into the pot. The Supreme Buddha explains, just like that, there are some people in this world who listens to the Dhamma and pays attention to the beginning, middle and end. Not just while listening, but also after leaving the monastery. The Supreme Buddha explains, only such people are able to contemplate, investigate the Dhamma they have learned and put an end to suffering. So meritorious disciples, you must think about this through your own life and ask yourself, am I an overturned pot? Do I have lap-like wisdom? Am I like a lap? Or am I like upright pot? Our goal must be to be an upright pot, because only an upright pot can collect water. If you collect the Dhamma, if you retain the Dhamma, then only such a person is able to put an end to all suffering in this world. So in this way, the Supreme Buddha explains, the first thing you must do is listen to the Dhamma. Then you must try to retain the Dhamma you have learned. And the third factor that's explained here is he recites the Dhamma verbally. What's the third factor? So you first listen to the Dhamma, then you retain the Dhamma you have learned, and then you recite it verbally. The Supreme Buddha explains in the Dhammapada, if you do not recite things that you have memorized, then the Supreme Buddha explains, then those things you have memorized will be forgotten. So recitation is very important. That's why the Supreme Buddha explains here, you must recite what you have learned verbally. Because if you do not recite what you have learned verbally, what will happen? Yes, what will happen is you'll forget what you have memorized, what you have retained. The Supreme Buddha explains, if you do not recite, then your memory will become rusty. So that's the reason why the Supreme Buddha explains you must first listen, then retain the Dhamma, and then you must recite what you have learned. And then the Supreme Buddha explains, after you have done those first three things, the next thing you must do is you must examine what you have learned with your own mind. You must investigate, examine, contemplate. You must engage in wise consideration. You must try to understand it through your own mind. That's the fourth thing you must try to do. Then the Supreme Buddha explains, when you do these four things, first four things are sutta, that means you listen to the Dhamma. Datta, then you remember, you retain the Dhamma. Then vachasa paricita, you recite it verbally. Then manasanupekkhita, that means you investigate, contemplate. When you do these four things, ditthiya suppativitta, what happens is your view become purified. What does that mean? Your view become purified means you get a very clear, very good understanding of the Dhamma you have learned. It's a result of doing those four things that we mentioned before. If you listen well, if you retain what you have learned well, if you recite what you have learned frequently so that you don't forget what you have learned, and if you investigate, if you contemplate on the Dhamma, then what happens is you get a clear understanding of the Dhamma. You get a clear view. Your view in life becomes purified. And the Supreme Buddha explains, for such a person, four benefits are to be expected. Now, meritorious disciples, if we take a practical example of this, now suppose you go to the monastery and you get to hear about the sense faculties. You get to hear that these ears, you get to hear that these eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body and mind are impermanent. So now if you listened well with your full attention, then you can remember what you learned. And what do you do after you remember? When you retain what you learned in mind, then you must recite verbally what you have learned. So now you may be going to work. You may be on your way to work. You may be spending some free time, or you may be doing something else. If you have the time, then what you must do is you must recite what you learned verbally. You must say, these eyes are impermanent. These ears are impermanent. This nose is impermanent. This tongue is impermanent. This body is impermanent. This mind is impermanent. Now you can do this at any time. You can do this while you're waiting for the bus. You can do this while you're walking. You can do this while you're sitting. You can do this while you're waiting for someone. You can do this at any time during the day. So in this way, when you recite, you get a good memory in what you have learned. And then, what's the fourth step you must do? You must investigate, you must contemplate, you must think. The Supreme Buddha has explained that these eyes are impermanent. And so you must think, it's true. These eyes change. The eyes that I had when I was a child is not the eyes that I have now. They're weak. I cannot see as I used to. My eyes are weaker now. And little by little, my eyesight is changing. It's weakening. And there'll come a time where I won't be able to see. So in this way, you can investigate through your own mind why the Supreme Buddha has explained that these eyes are impermanent. And you can do the same for the ears. You can experience through yourself. You were able to hear well when you were young, but as you age, these ears change little by little. They change. And little by little, your ability to hear weakens. Your ears change. And at one point, they'll die. That's why the Supreme Buddha has explained that these ears are impermanent. And so when you investigate, when you contemplate, you get a good understanding, you get a clear understanding of the Dhamma. Now that's what the Supreme Buddha is explaining here. So the Supreme Buddha is explaining a person who does these 5 things, a person who listens to the Supreme Buddha's Dhamma, retains, remembers the Dhamma, then recites the Dhamma he has learned, and then contemplates, investigates, analyzes the Dhamma, gets a clear understanding, a clear comprehension in the Dhamma. And for such a person, the Supreme Buddha explains, can gain 4 benefits. So let's learn what those 4 benefits are. The Supreme Buddha explains here, a bhikkhu masters the Dhamma. Now, meritorious disciples, this Dhamma, the Supreme Buddha's teaching, the Supreme Buddha's Dhamma, is divided into 9 sections. The first are known as suttas, discourses. The next is sutta geya. Geya means mixed prose and verse. So sometimes the Supreme Buddha teaches something, and towards the end of that teaching, the Supreme Buddha summarizes what he taught into a verse. So that's known as geya, mixed prose and verse. Then there's another section called Vaiyakarana, expositions. Expositions means the Supreme Buddha takes a certain topic and expands on it, explains it well in detail. Now if you take the Supreme Buddha's first Dhamma talk, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, it's considered exposition because the Supreme Buddha explains well in detail the 4 noble truths. So that's known as expositions. So there are suttas, discourses, geya, mixed prose and verses, and Vaiyakarana, expositions. And the 4th is known as gatha, that means verses. Sometimes the Supreme Buddha tries to make a point solely through verses, through stanzas. Now if we take Dhammapada, for example, is an example of verses. And then there is something called udana, inspired utterances. When the Supreme Buddha feels very joyous, sometimes effortlessly the Supreme Buddha states things. They're known as inspired utterances, udana. And then there are quotations, iti uttaka. In Pali it's known as iti uttaka, that means quotations. Sometimes the Supreme Buddha says things directly. If you do this, this will happen. Now they're known as quotations of the Supreme Buddha. These inspired utterances and quotations are found in the Khuddaka Nikaya of the Pali Canon. And then there's a section in this Dhamma known as Jataka. Jataka means birth stories, past lives of the Supreme Buddha. Sometimes a great teacher teaches about the Supreme Buddha's past lives to teach us about this long journey of samsara, to teach us the danger of this samsara, to teach us that if a person travels in this samsara, he has to be born in the animal world, he has to be born in hell. To teach us about the suffering that a person must endure in this samsara, the Supreme Buddha teaches about his past lives. And they are known as Jataka, birth stories. There's a section called Abhuta Dhamma, amazing accounts. Now, as you know, our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, has amazing accounts in his life. For example, when the Supreme Buddha was born into this world, 10,000 world systems shook, and a bright light spread throughout the whole world. Now, these are amazing accounts. They are not something that happens in the ordinary world. In this way, there are many amazing accounts, miraculous accounts of the Supreme Buddha's life. And so these are sectioned into a section called Abhuta Dhamma, amazing accounts. And then the ninth section is Vedalla. It's known as questions and answers. So Dhamma discussions. In the Dhamma, sometimes people come and ask the Supreme Buddha questions, and the Supreme Buddha answers. And there are also Dhamma discussions that are done by Arahants. Now, meritorious disciples, sometimes Arahants engage in Dhamma discussions not to gain anything for themselves, because they are Arahants. They have attained the maximum state that's to be attained in this world. But Arahants engage in Dhamma discussions because the person who's listening to the Dhamma can benefit from it. That's the reason why Arahants engage in Dhamma discussions. If you remember suttas like Chula Vedala Sutta, Maha Vedala Sutta, these are Dhamma discussions done by Arahants. So meritorious disciples, in this way, the Dhamma is sectioned into 9 sections. So the Supreme Buddha explains, here Bhikkhu masters the Dhamma. So he learns and he masters these 9 sections of the Dhamma. And he follows what he has learned by ear, he recites them, he remembers them, he recites them verbally, and he examines what he has learned. He examines the Dhamma he has learned with the mind. And when he does so, what happens? He gets a clear understanding. He gets a good understanding of the Dhamma that he learned. Now then the Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, he passes away muddle-minded. So what did the Supreme Buddha say? For such a person who has learned the Dhamma well, if he passes away muddle-minded, now here muddled-minded means he dies unmindful. He's not mindful at the time of his death. The Supreme Buddha explains, he passes away muddled in mind and is reborn into a certain group of devas. So what the Supreme Buddha is saying is, if a person who has practiced the Dhamma in the way that we talked about before, he listened to the Dhamma, he retained the Dhamma, he recited the Dhamma, he investigated the Dhamma, and he got a good understanding of the Dhamma. So he's a person who practiced the Dhamma. For such a person, even if he dies unmindfully, with a muddled mind, the Supreme Buddha explains, he is going to be born in the heavenly world. Now, meritorious disciples, we do not know, we cannot guarantee that we will be fully mindful at the time of our death, because we don't know when we'll die. We don't have a guarantee of the day we die. The Supreme Buddha explains, this life is like a water droplet that's at the edge of a grass leaf. That water droplet may fall at any moment. So we don't know whether we'll be able to have full mindfulness at the time of our death. Because sometimes we may die while being subject to an operation and we may be unconscious. Or sometimes we may die by having to face an accident. And when you're in an accident, you may be shocked and you may not have the ability to understand what's even happening around you. So the Supreme Buddha explains, if such a person dies in such a state, unmindfully, he is able to be reborn in the heavenly world. Why? Because he practiced the Dhamma in the way that was mentioned before. He listened to the Dhamma, he retained the Dhamma, he recited the Dhamma, he investigated the Dhamma, and he got a good understanding, clear comprehension, clear understanding of the Dhamma. As a result of practicing the Dhamma, in his next life, he is reborn in the heavenly world. Now, meritorious disciples, we don't get to hear about the heavenly world a lot. As you know, our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, is Lokavidu. The Supreme Buddha understood all worlds. And the Supreme Buddha had the maximum knowledge a person can gain about Deva worlds, about heavenly worlds. The Supreme Buddha has explained only a person who has merit, who has collected merit, is reborn in the heavenly world. The Supreme Buddha has explained when you give alms to others, when you protect precepts, when you're virtuous, then you are able to be reborn in the heavenly world. Now, if you take a look at Vimanavattu, stories of gods, in those stories, a lot of the gods say, "Oh, I offered water to an arahant, and with that merit I was reborn in the heavenly world." Or they say, "I practiced the precepts, I observed the 5 precepts, and as a result of the merit I collected, I was reborn in heaven." So in this way, when you collect merit, you're able to be reborn in the heavenly world. But the important thing is only a person who has the worldly right view collects merit. Now, what is the worldly right view? Worldly right view means that person understands the fact there are results of giving, there are results of offerings, there are results of making offerings to others, there are results of helping others, being of service to others. He understands the fact that there's something called good actions and good results. There's something called bad actions and bad results. So he understands the fact that there's something called karma in this world. So only a person who understands this reality can collect merit. And so if you collect merit, the Supreme Buddha explains, you're able to be reborn in the heavenly world. But meritorious disciples, the Supreme Buddha explains, "O bhikkhus," once the Supreme Buddha asks the bhikkhus, "O bhikkhus, look at the amount of soil in my fingernail. Is the amount of soil in my fingernail greater, or is this whole earth greater?" So the bhikkhus replied, "O Venerable Sir, the soil in this earth is greater than the amount of soil in your fingernail." At that time, the Supreme Buddha explains, "O bhikkhus, among the devas who pass away from the heavenly world, only an amount of devas, like the amount of soil on my fingernail, is reborn in the heavenly world again. An amount of devas, like the amount of soil on this earth, is reborn in bad destinations." So even if you're reborn in the heavenly world, after that merit is exhausted, what happens? You come back, you're reborn in bad destinations again. Out of the devas in Deva world, an amount like the amount of soil in this earth is reborn in bad destinations. Only an amount like the amount of soil on the Supreme Buddha's fingernails is reborn in the heavenly worlds again. The reason being, only a person who practices this Dhamma, who makes a humble effort to practice the Dhamma, is able to continue his practice in the Deva world. We'll learn what that means as we learn the sutta. But what you must realize is, among devas, if you do not practice the Dhamma, if you just give alms, if you just protect precepts for the sake of being reborn in the heavenly world, the danger you have is you are going to come back to the lower worlds and you are not able to escape from suffering. But if you make an earnest effort, if you make an humble effort to practice the Dhamma, then you can be reborn in the heavenly worlds and you can continue that Dhamma practice, and you'll be able to put an end to suffering. Now, as you know, in today's society, a lot of people only concentrate on giving, on practicing generosity, or maybe simply just protecting the precepts. They become satisfied with just those things. But what you must realize is you must do something more than just that. You must try to listen to the Dhamma, retain the Dhamma, practice the Dhamma, investigate the Dhamma. If you do so, then not only are you able to benefit from that in this life, but you'll be able to take it with you to your next life. Now we'll see how this happens further in this sutta. So the Supreme Buddha explains that person who practiced the Dhamma, even if he dies muddle-minded, he is reborn in the Deva world. And what happens is there, when he is reborn in the Deva world, what happens is he remembers his past life. What happens? He remembers his past life. The Supreme Buddha explains the arising of his memory may be sluggish, it may be slow. But the moment he remembers, he quickly reaches distinction. Now let's try to understand what this means. So the Supreme Buddha explains, when that person who practiced the Dhamma in this human life is reborn in the heavenly world, what happens is he remembers his past life. He remembers his human life. He remembers, oh, I was born a human being. I listened to the Supreme Buddha's Dhamma. I practiced the Dhamma. He remembers this. The Supreme Buddha explains, his memory may be slow. It may be sluggish. But the Supreme Buddha explains, but the moment he remembers, he quickly reaches distinction. Now what does distinction mean? Now in the ordinary world, distinction, we say, oh, I got a distinction. That means you got an excellent state or important state, a special state. Now in the Supreme Buddha's dispensation, what's referred to as distinction? What's a special state? What's an excellent state? Excellent state means distinction, means attaining fruits and paths in this Dhamma. That is, attaining fruits meaning he either becomes a Sotapanna disciple, he becomes a stream entrant. That's the first fruit a person can attain if he practices the Dhamma. If you become a stream entrant, you're able to escape from this samsara within a maximum of 7 lives. And the second fruit you can attain in this Dhamma is the fruit of Sakadagami, once returner. If you become a once returner, then you only come back to this world of sensual pleasures for just one life. You're reborn again only once, and in that life you attain Nibbana. And the third fruit you can attain is the fruit of Anagami, a never returner. If you become a never returner, then you're never going to come back to these worlds of sensual pleasures. In your next life, you're born in the Brahma world, in Anagami Brahma worlds, and you attain Nibbana there. You put an end to all suffering there. And the fourth fruit you can attain in this dispensation is the fruit of Arhantship. If you become an Arhant, and of course, you put an end to all suffering in this world. You escape from this cycle of birth and death. So the Supreme Buddha explains, for a person who practices the Dhamma, even if he dies unmindfully, he is able to be reborn in the heavenly world. And when he is reborn in the heavenly world, what happens is he remembers his past life. He remembers the fact that he practiced the Dhamma. And the moment he remembers, he quickly reaches distinction. That means he quickly continues the practice that he did when he was in the human world. That means he practices the Dhamma in the heavenly world and he quickly attains fruits. He either becomes a Sotapanna disciple, becomes a once returner, never returner, or he reaches Arhantship. Now there's an important point here. Here it says, his memory may be slow, but he quickly reaches distinction. Now, meritorious disciples, if we take the human world, no matter how much we practice the Dhamma, no matter how much we listen to the Dhamma, our progress in the Dhamma is very slow. But here you can see, in the Deva world, in the heavenly world, you can quickly attain fruits. You can quickly attain results when you're reborn in the heavenly world. That's a benefit of being reborn in the heavenly world. And then the Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, this is the first benefit to be expected when one has followed the teaching by ear, when one has recited them verbally, examined Dhamma, and when one has gotten a clear view in the Dhamma. So this is the first benefit a person can gain. And then the Supreme Buddha explained the second benefit. So there's one type of person who's reborn in the heavenly world, and he remembers his past life, and he quickly gains his memory, and he quickly reaches distinction. And then the Supreme Buddha explains, again bhikkhus, a bhikkhu masters the Dhamma. So in the same way, he listens to discourses, verses, expositions, questions and answers. He listens to the Dhamma, and he has followed those teachings by ear. So he listens, he retains the Dhamma, he recites them verbally, he investigates it, and he gets a good understanding of the Dhamma. Now this person passes away unmindfully, and he is also reborn into a certain group of devas. So he is also reborn in the heavenly world. There, this deva isn't able to remember his past life. So he is not able to remember his past life on his own. But what happens is a bhikkhu with psychic potency who has attained mastery of the mind teaches the Dhamma to an assembly of devas. So what happens? He gets to listen to a bhikkhu who has psychic abilities. So as you know, there are certain bhikkhus during the Supreme Buddha's time. Bhikkhus who had psychic abilities went to the heavenly world and taught the Dhamma to devas. So the Supreme Buddha explains, so this deva gets to listen to such a bhikkhu who is teaching the Dhamma. So he isn't able to remember his past life on his own. But what happens, he comes across a bhikkhu who's teaching the Dhamma in the heavenly world. Now this is not possible today. But during the time of the Supreme Buddha, this is something that constantly happened. Arahants and other bhikkhus who had psychic potencies constantly went to the heavenly world with their psychic powers, and they taught the Dhamma. And so the Supreme Buddha explains, when that deva gets to listen to the Dhamma that's being taught by a bhikkhu, it occurs to him, this is the Dhamma and discipline in which I formerly lived a spiritual life. So he remembers, oh, this Dhamma seems familiar to me. This is something that I practiced in my past life. So he remembers only after listening to the bhikkhu. And the Supreme Buddha explains, the arising of his memory may be slow, but then that being quickly reaches distinction. So after having listened to the Dhamma from a bhikkhu with psychic potency who's teaching the Dhamma in the heavenly world, what happens is he listens to the Dhamma and he quickly attains distinctions. That means he quickly attains fruits of the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains a simile. Suppose a man is very familiar with the sound of a drum. Now while he is traveling in the highway, he might hear the sound of a drum. And when he hears, he is not at all confused as to what sound it is. He quickly recognizes the fact that that's a drum sound. The Supreme Buddha explains, just like that person who is very familiar with the sound of a drum quickly recognizes it as being a sound of a drum. The person who gets to hear the Dhamma from a bhikkhu who's teaching the Dhamma in the heavenly world quickly recognizes the Dhamma, and he practices the Dhamma and he reaches distinction. He attains the fruits of the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, this is the second benefit of practicing the Dhamma. And then the Supreme Buddha explains the third benefit. The Supreme Buddha explains, again, a bhikkhu masters the Dhamma. So the discourses, expositions, verses, prose. In this way, he masters the Dhamma. He has followed those teachings by ear, so that means he has listened to the Dhamma, he has retained the Dhamma, he recites the Dhamma, and then he investigates the Dhamma he has learned. And as a result, he gets a good understanding, a clear knowledge in the Dhamma. And that person too passes away muddle-minded. That means he may pass away unmindfully. But regardless, he is reborn into a certain group of devas. So he is reborn in the heavenly world. The Supreme Buddha explains, there he is not able to remember his past life on his own. So like the first deva, this third deva, the third god, isn't able to remember his past life on his own. And he doesn't get to hear a bhikkhu with psychic potency who has attained mastery teaching the Dhamma to an assembly of devas. So he doesn't get to hear the Dhamma from a bhikkhu either. However, a young deva teaches the Dhamma to an assembly of devas. So who teaches the Dhamma? A young deva. So another deva teaches the Dhamma to assembly of devas in the heavenly world. Now in this, it's very clear, beings in the heavenly world discuss the Dhamma. They talk about the Dhamma. They teach each other the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains, when he gets to listen to the Dhamma that's being taught by another deva, it occurs to him, oh, this seems familiar to me. This is the Dhamma and discipline in which I formerly lived in the spiritual life. So he remembers the fact that he has practiced this Dhamma in his past life, in his previous life. The Blessed One explains, the arising of his memory may be slow, but then he quickly reaches distinction. So he too, after having listened to the Dhamma that's being taught by a deva, what happens? He quickly remembers the fact that he has practiced this Dhamma, and he develops that Dhamma further, and he attains the fruits of this Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains a simile. O bhikkhus, suppose a man was very skilled in the sound of a conch. Now while he is traveling in the highway, he might hear the sound of a conch, and when he does so, he is not at all confused, perplexed, uncertain about the sound. Why? Because he is very familiar with the sound of a conch. When he hears the sound of a conch, he quickly recognizes that it's the sound of a conch. The Supreme Buddha explains, just like that, so too, a bhikkhu who has mastered the Dhamma, when he gets to hear the Dhamma from a young deva, what happens is he quickly remembers his past life. He remembers the fact that he has practiced the Dhamma, and what happens is he quickly gains the fruits that's to be gained in this Dhamma path. That's the third benefit of practicing the Dhamma. So meritorious disciples, then the Supreme Buddha explains the fourth benefit. The Supreme Buddha explains, so just like previously, this person practices the Dhamma, he listens to the Dhamma, he remembers the Dhamma, he recites verbally, he investigates, and he gets a good understanding of the Dhamma. And this person passes away unmindfully, with a muddled mind. So the Supreme Buddha explains, he may pass away with a muddled mind, but he is reborn into a certain group of devas. The Supreme Buddha explains, this fourth deva, he's not able to remember on his own the past life. And neither is he able to listen to Dhamma from a bhikkhu. He doesn't get the opportunity to listen to the Dhamma from another deva either. However, what happens is another fellow deva in the heavenly world asks him, who are you? Where were you before? So what happens in this fourth benefit? What happens is he doesn't get to remember his past life on his own. Neither does he get to listen to the Dhamma from a bhikkhu who has psychic potencies. Neither does he get to listen to the Dhamma from a fellow deva, a young deva. But another deva who is born spontaneously reminds him by asking him, do you remember, dear sir, do you remember where we formerly lived the spiritual life? And so the other Deva says, I remember, dear sir, I remember. So in this way, they remind each other of their past life. So now what the Supreme Buddha is explaining here is, when that Deva, after having practiced the Dhamma, he is reborn in the heavenly world. And what happens is, another Deva comes and he reminds, do you remember how we practiced the Dhamma in the previous life? So who is reminding him? Another fellow monk who practiced the Dhamma in the previous life. Now, for example, you go to the monastery with a group of friends, right? And so those friends that you practice the Dhamma together, now suppose one person dies before you and he's reborn in the heavenly world. And so when you're reborn in the heavenly world, what happens is, that Deva comes and reminds you, remember, do you remember how we went to the monastery together? Do you remember how we went to observe the precepts on Uposatha days together? In this way, another Deva comes and reminds you of your spiritual life that you led in the previous human life. And at that moment, you remember. The Supreme Buddha explains, when another Deva reminds you, your memory may be slow, but you quickly remember, and that person, that Deva, quickly reaches distinction. So another Deva comes and reminds you of the Dhamma practice that you practiced in your previous life, and when you remember that, you quickly practice the Dhamma further and you gain distinction. You attain the fruits of the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explains a simile. Suppose there were two friends who had played together in the mud. By chance, they would meet one another in later life. Then one friend would say to the other, do you remember this friend? Do you remember that friend? And the other friend would say, yes, I remember friend, I remember friend. So it's like two friends who played together, meeting after a long time. What do you usually do? You ask, do you remember how we played in this way when we were little? So in this way you remind each other of your past. The Supreme Buddha explains, this situation is just like that. When you're reborn in the heavenly world, another Deva comes and reminds you of the Dhamma practice that you did together in the previous life. And when you gain mindfulness of the Dhamma practice, you're able to practice the Dhamma even further and attain distinction, gain distinction. The Supreme Buddha explains, O bhikkhus, this is the fourth benefit to be expected when one has followed the teaching by ear, recited them verbally, examined them with the mind, and penetrated them by view. The Supreme Buddha explains, these are the four benefits to be expected when one has followed, when one has practiced the Dhamma. So meritorious disciples, in this sutta you can clearly see that the Dhamma practice that we do in this life does not go to waste. If you humbly, if you make an earnest effort to practice the Dhamma, if you listen to the Dhamma well, if you remember the Dhamma, if you recite the Dhamma, if you investigate the Dhamma, and if you gain a good understanding, a clear comprehension of the Dhamma, then the Dhamma knowledge that you gain does not go to waste. When you're reborn in the next life, in the heavenly world, then you're able to practice the Dhamma even further, and you're able to attain the fruits that you are not able to attain in the human life. And you're able to have the ability to put an end to suffering. Now the important thing here is that the Dhamma practice we do does not go to waste. But of course you must understand, the Supreme Buddha taught this sutta to teach us that if you make an effort to practice the Dhamma, then the fruits will come to you, will follow you. Even though you're not able to gain the fruits in this life, you'll be able to gain the fruits in your next life. But you must remember, just because you listen to this sutta, you must not procrastinate in the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha does not praise continuing in this samsara. The Supreme Buddha has explained, if you are a lay follower, then your goal must be to become an anagami in this human life. So that's your goal. Just because you listen to this sutta, you must not procrastinate, you must not delay practicing the Dhamma, thinking, oh, I practice the Dhamma a bit in this life, so I can continue my Dhamma practice in the next life. That's not what you must think. What you must realize is the value of practicing the Dhamma in this life. What you must realize is the Supreme Buddha has taught us to be diligent in the Dhamma. The Supreme Buddha explained, once a bhikkhu was procrastinating. He was delaying the Dhamma practice. And at that time the Supreme Buddha went and asked, "Oh bhikkhu, why are you delaying your Dhamma practice?" And at that time he said, "Oh Venerable Sir, now I have attained the state of an anagami, so now I'm thinking of being reborn in the Brahma world and attaining Nibbana there." Now at that time the Supreme Buddha explained, "Oh bhikkhu, do not procrastinate." The Supreme Buddha asks, "Oh bhikkhu, even if there is only a small amount of feces, or whether there is a big amount of feces, doesn't both amounts emit the same smell? Doesn't it emit the same bad smell?" Just like that, the Supreme Buddha explains, "O bhikkhu, I do not praise continuing in this samsara, even for the time it takes to blink, even for such a short time. I do not praise continuing in this samsara." Meritorious disciples, our great teachers saw the danger in continuing to travel in this samsara. So the Supreme Buddha advised us to practice the Dhamma in this very life and gain the results. The Supreme Buddha asked us to escape from suffering. But the Supreme Buddha saw that with time, people's minds get deteriorated, people's defilements get aroused. And so during such times, it's not easy to gain the result of the Dhamma. So that's why the Supreme Buddha explained suttas like this, to give us hope, to let us know that if a person makes an earnest effort, a humble effort to practice the Dhamma, even though his progress may be slow, he's able to continue what he has learned in this life and further develop it in the next life when he is reborn in the heavenly world. So meritorious disciples, I bless you. May you have the opportunity to gain advantage of this amazing Dhamma that we hear. May you have the opportunity to practice the Dhamma and become diligent in the Dhamma. May you have the opportunity to understand the Supreme Buddha's Dhamma in this Gautama Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.